The set lights glowed as Denzel Washington stepped onto the stage for a live town hall-style broadcast. The audience applauded warmly, but the energy had an undercurrent of something bigger than routine. Tonight, words would matter more than ever. Rachel Maddow sat across from him, poised and professional, holding her notes. The host introduced them with measured courtesy. They were here to talk about global tensions, media responsibility, and truth in a polarized age. Rachel began. She said, "Denzel, thanks for being here. Your influence stretches far beyond the screen. Let's start with what concerns you most." Denzel nodded. He said, "Communities are fractured, media is fractured, and truth is losing ground. That worries me more than any war abroad." Rachel said, "You've criticized media silos before, where people hear only what fits their worldview. Do you think mainstream outlets contribute to that?" Denzel said, "Yes. Because if your first priority is engagement instead of enlightenment, you're not informing, you're performing." Rachel's eyes narrowed slightly. She said, "That's a pretty big accusation. Are you saying shows like mine perform rather than inform?" Denzel said, "When framing information becomes framing for ratings, yes." Rachel said, "Let's dig into that. You've praised investigative reporting, but you've also said the media can push narratives. Can you point to an example?" Denzel paused thoughtfully. He said, "When the same story is told over and over without dissent, it becomes a message, not a fact." Rachel said, "Are you referring to reporting on political figures, public health, foreign policy?" Denzel said, "All of it." Rachel's tone sharpened. She said, "So if I report on misinformation or hold officials accountable, I'm performing?" Denzel said, "If that reporting becomes rhetoric dressed as analysis, yes." Rachel leaned in. She said, "Rickety ground. You're a storyteller, yes, but you choose your lines. Don't media outlets do the same based on research?" Denzel said, "Research is valuable, but context is essential. Without it, performance fills the gap." Rachel adjusted her notes. She said, "I'm trying to understand where you draw the line between informing and performing." Denzel said softly, "When the goal is to rally, not reveal." Rachel's expression darkened. She said, "Would you say I've ever rallied without revealing?" Denzel said firmly, "At times." A hush fell. The audience leaned in. Rachel said quietly, "That's a direct critique." Denzel said, "It's an invitation to reflect." Rachel's jaw tightened. She said, "Why are we turning this into a personal exchange?" Denzel said, "Because conversation loses meaning when accountability is polite." Another silence. Rachel said, "So if I ask a tough question, you see it as rallying?" Denzel paused. He said, "If that question comes with applause lines before answers, yes." Rachel's smile faltered. She said, "Applause lines?" Denzel said, "Statements dressed as questions. That's performance." Rachel said, "So how should media handle public reactions?" Denzel said, "By prioritizing depth over volume." Rachel said, "Depth takes time. Audiences demand speed." Denzel said, "Truth rarely fits into a soundbite." The tension grew. The host interjected, seeking to steer back. He said, "You're saying the public sphere encourages simplification. Where's the solution?" Denzel said, "Patience, deliberation, and bravery." Rachel said, "Bravery or privilege?" Denzel said calmly, "Both." The room tensed again as the show cut to a short break, leaving viewers to process the confrontation. The cameras came back from break, but the temperature on stage had not cooled. Rachel Maddow sat with her hands folded, composed but no longer relaxed. Denzel Washington sat across from her, unchanged, still calm, still deliberate. The moderator said, "Before the break, Denzel challenged how we communicate truth in a media-driven world. Rachel, your thoughts?" Rachel said, "I think it's dangerous to accuse journalists of performative intent without evidence. It feeds cynicism." Denzel said, And I think it's dangerous to assume journalism is immune to theater. Rachel said, so we're part of the problem now. Denzel said, you're part of the solution. But only if you acknowledge when you've been part of the problem too. Rachel said, I stand by my reporting. I stand by my sourcing. Denzel said, I'm not challenging your sources. I'm challenging your framing. Rachel said, that sounds like semantics. Denzel said, it's not. Because how you frame a story determines how millions interpret reality. Rachel said, and you think I distort reality? Denzel said, I think you simplify it to fit an emotional arc. Rachel said sharply, that's a serious accusation. Denzel said, so is claiming moral authority while refusing to self-examine. Rachel looked directly at him. She said, you seem to be accusing me of something you won't name. Be clear. Denzel leaned forward. He said, you don't even believe what you're saying half the time. The words dropped with finality. The audience gasped softly. Rachel froze. She said, excuse me? Denzel said quietly, you've been on air long enough to know the difference between what the story is and what the audience wants it to be. And you've chosen the latter more times than you admit. Rachel said, I speak the truth. I follow the facts. Denzel said, then why do you bend them to fit your outrage? Rachel's face flushed. She said, I work in an industry that depends on clarity, on trust. Denzel said, then stop selling certainty where there is none. Stop pretending you're surprised when the world doesn't match your script. Rachel stood up. She said, this is condescension dressed as insight. Denzel remained seated. He said, no. This is reality confronting convenience. Rachel's voice rose. She said, you accuse me of performance. But you're the actor. Denzel said softly, I never denied I was. You did. The room went still. Even the moderator was silent. Rachel took a breath. She said, you know what? Maybe you're right. Maybe we all perform, in some way. Denzel said, it's not about performance. It's about honesty within it. Rachel didn't respond. Not yet. The host signaled for another break, but the audience didn't move. No one wanted to blink. The third segment opened in silence. The usual upbeat music felt misplaced. Rachel Maddow returned to her seat, her expression quieter now. Denzel Washington had not moved. He sat with the same calm stillness that had carried him through decades of public life. The moderator said cautiously, Rachel, would you like to respond? Rachel said, I've spent my career believing that information makes people freer, that the more we know, the better we become. Denzel nodded. He said, that's noble, and often true. Rachel said, but maybe I have simplified things. Maybe I've leaned too hard into moral binaries when the world is murkier. Denzel said, we all want heroes and villains. They make stories easier. But real life doesn't work that way. Rachel paused. She said, then how do we speak truth if we can't draw lines? Denzel said, by drawing them gently, by admitting when we're uncertain, by showing the work, not just the conclusion. Rachel said, you think I've lost the public's trust. Denzel said, I think you've stopped talking like someone who still earns it. But you can start again. She looked at him, not with anger now, but reflection. She said, you're right about one thing. Somewhere along the way, I did start talking more about what I believe than what I know. Denzel said, belief is powerful, but so is humility. She asked, why say this to me? Why now? He said, because people listen to you. Because the world's on fire, and your microphone still reaches millions. Rachel looked into the audience. She said, maybe I needed to hear this more than I knew. Denzel nodded. He said, we all do sometimes. The moderator let the moment linger. Then he said, final thoughts. Denzel said, truth doesn't shout. It doesn't need to. But it does need to be spoken by people who mean it. Rachel said, then maybe it's time I start speaking a little less and listening a little more. There was no applause. Just stillness. Respectful, heavy, honest. As the show faded to its final commercial, the audience remained silent. Changed. Later that night, Rachel opened her show with a brief monologue. She said, "Tonight, I won't be leading with headlines. Tonight, I'll be re-examining how we tell stories, including my own." She looked into the lens. And if that's uncomfortable, good. Because discomfort often means we're getting close to something real. She paused. "Let's get uncomfortable together." The screen faded to black. And in that stillness, a different kind of truth began. This is the USA Liberty. Subscribe if you believe the loudest voice isn't always the wisest, and that sometimes real courage is admitting you were wrong. Because if truth matters to you, this is where it lives.